Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about how to stop using cognitive distortions and biases. This is part of a series I'm doing on critical thinking and media literacy that's really designed to help you learn the ways in which our minds are vulnerable to manipulation. And this video is going to be focused specifically on cognitive distortions and cognitive biases. Distortions, if you're not aware, are these irrational, often emotion-charged ways of thinking that skew our perception of reality, whereas cognitive biases are mental shortcuts that sometimes give us incorrect judgments or perceptions. Unpacking distortions tends to happen more in clinical settings like in therapy, while unpacking cognitive biases tends to happen more in the research. Also related to these two concepts, but won't be included in this video, are cognitive errors, which are reasoning mistakes such as logical fallacies. The reason I won't cover that in this video is that will be in a separate video. But basically what I'm talking about today is ways that our minds make mistakes in perceiving reality accurately. And predatory people, whether they are in the media, in propaganda, in politics, weaponize these very human mental flaws against us. So we need to know to recognize when we're falling into these mental traps and nip it in the bud. That's exactly what I'll be teaching you in this video. So let's get started. Let's start off with cognitive distortions. And by the way, if you recognize that you or someone else in your life has done any of these recently, I would love to hear your examples down in the comments and have almost like a database of examples down in this video. Also, writing these things down, thinking about applying it to your own life helps you retain the information, so it's kind of win-win. One common cognitive distortion is all or nothing or black and white thinking. This is where you assume that things are always or never a certain way, where there's no middle ground, and it completely erases any sort of nuance or context. For example, you never take the trash out on time, or you're either with me or you're against me. Or curse words can be hurtful in some contexts, so let's make curse words illegal. Very rarely do things fall into very black and white territory. Most of the time, if we're falling into all or nothing thinking, it prevents us from seeing reality for what it is. I do have an entire video on minimizing black and white thinking if you want to check that out up here. Overgeneralization is another one, which is when you use one specific instance of something to justify a broad generalization. For example, I failed this one math test, therefore I'm bad at math. Or I had a bad experience with Ryanair, therefore everyone at Ryanair is an asshole. Overgeneralizing helped us survive back in the day. For example, when we were living out in the wild in the jungle, a good general rule of thumb was that brightly colored animals are venomous. But of course not every single brightly colored animal is venomous. It didn't matter if it was true or not. What mattered to our survival was to believe that generalization. These days, we need to put aside what helped us survive historically in order to see reality for what it truly is. These days, surviving requires seeing reality for what it is. We can no longer just rely on cognitive distortions to keep us safe. Another one is mental filtering, which is focusing only on the negatives of a situation while discounting the positives. For example, your supervisor praised your work this past quarter, but all you can remember from your evaluation meeting is the tiny little piece of negative feedback they gave you. Or you're waiting in line to pick up your green card, but instead of thinking about how great that I'm getting a green card, all you can focus on is how long the line is. There is also jumping to conclusions, which is making assumptions without evidence. And this one includes a few subtypes as well, such as mind reading is one of them. Assuming you know someone's intentions or thoughts without evidence for it. For example, you might say, that girl just looked my outfit up and down. She's probably judging me. Is she? I mean, maybe she was admiring it. If there was no evidence that she was negatively evaluating you while she made the gesture, it's not really fair to pretend you're a mind reader. Caveat here. If you do actually have evidence, like maybe she was sneering, she was whispering to her friends while looking you up and down, then that's not jumping to conclusions because you clearly do have some evidence. But you're still never going to be 100% sure what someone else is thinking unless you clarify. And even then, you never know what's in someone else's head. Another example of jumping to conclusions is fortune telling, which is when you assume that you know what's going to happen in the future despite not having evidence for it. So you might say, I just have a feeling that Korea is going to get into a war with France. Again, a caveat here is if you actually have evidence to back up your assumption, like if you can actually point to certain aspects of political tension between these two countries and connect what's going on currently with past points in history where two countries went to war, then maybe you do have some evidence, but still you're not a fortune teller. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. The key question to ask yourself anytime you're trying to predict something but you don't want to jump to conclusions is, what is the quality of the evidence for my belief? Then you have emotional reasoning, which is believing something must be true just because it feels true. For example, I feel anxious, therefore something bad must be about to happen. Or, I feel angry at you, therefore you did something to disrespect me. Emotional reasoning hinges on the assumption that our emotions always fit the facts of the situation. For example, it fits the facts to feel angry when someone disrespects us. It fits the facts to feel anxious when we are in imminent danger. But sometimes our emotions don't fit the facts, which is why we need to check the facts of the situation. So if we're just taking our emotions at face value and they don't actually fit the facts of the situation, then that becomes emotional reasoning. Then there are should statements, which are trying to set rigid rules for yourself and other people. For example, I should be perfect at playing the piano, or other people should give me what I want when I ask for it. Morality is a lot more relative than we realize. It's a lot more influenced by culture, upbringing, and emotions than we realize. If you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend the book The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. He is a morality researcher that really goes into how a lot of our moral development comes down to our emotions. So when we make very rigid statements about what we and other people should be doing from a moral point of view, we're basically just being blind about our own personal biases. Of course, there are some should statements that are reasonable and help us survive both as individuals and as a society, such as you shouldn't harm other people. What I'm talking about here is actually very rigid, specific shoulds that don't actually hold up against scrutiny when you examine them. Another cognitive distortion is labeling, which is assigning a very global label to yourself or to other people. For example, saying, my son is so sweet and well-behaved. My daughter, on the other hand, is defiant and disrespectful. Or, I'm not good at writing. Or, I can't do that because I'm neurodivergent. Labels can be helpful in certain contexts, like figuring out what type of treatment is evidence-based for an accurate diagnosis, but they can also be quite limiting. And the truth is, human behavior is highly fluid and context dependent. When we put ourselves and others into rigid little boxes, we not only limit ourselves from seeing reality for what it is, but we can also create self-fulfilling prophecies where either we or the person we're putting that expectation on proves us right. Then there's also personalization, which is blaming yourself for events outside of your control. For example, of course I got laid off during the recession. I should have worked over 40 hours a week to get them to keep me, when really it had nothing to do with your performance, they were just cutting their losses. Or assuming that the person who is needlessly rude to you at the airport is just doing it because there's something personal about you that they hate, when really it was them having a bad day. Remember, where it concerns fully developed adults, your behavior is your responsibility and their behavior is their responsibility. Do not take someone else's shitty behavior personally if there's no evidence that it's actually about you. Then there's also blaming, which is holding other people responsible for your own emotions or problems. For example, saying, I wouldn't have yelled at you if you hadn't broken that glass. You know, when people are always trying to find someone to blame, even in situations where maybe there isn't someone to blame or someone just made like a very human small mistake. It's kind of the opposite of the last cognitive distortion I mentioned. It's trying to make your behavior other people's problem and other people's responsibility. There's also catastrophizing, which is expecting the worst case scenario to happen in the future. For example, my boss asked to speak to me on Wednesday. I just know he's going to fire me. Maybe he's going to give you some feedback for improvement, or maybe actually some positive feedback or promotion, or just wants to let you know about a new project. Without evidence, you can't just assume the worst case scenario. That's why I have an exercise in the personal growth journal geared at getting you to identify the most realistic case scenario. In that exercise, I emphasize that I think a healthy attitude is to hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and assume that the most likely outcome is the midpoint between the two, what I call the most realistic case scenario. And lastly, there is the control fallacy, which is believing that you or others are entirely responsible or have no control at all over what happens. For example, you might say, there's no point working hard in your career. The people who succeed only do so because they have connections. Or there's no excuse to not succeed. It's completely within your control. Basically, a black and white form of the internal or external locus of control. Locus of control is to what extent you think internal or external factors explains what happens in your life. Internal locus of control is considered the healthiest, psychologically speaking. It is the one you want to aim for absolutely. But it's not about believing that everything is within your control, because that becomes delusional. It's healthy to acknowledge that not everything is within your control, as long as you focus on what is within your control, right? So a healthy person says, there are things I can do, there are things that I can't do to affect this outcome. Let me focus on what I can do. This is by no means a comprehensive list of cognitive distortions, but let's now go into cognitive biases as well. Up first, we have confirmation bias. Many of us have heard of it before. It's when you only focus on information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs while ignoring information that disproves them. For example, let's say that you believe blank scientific claim, fill in the blank. So you look up articles that support that narrative. And when you come across any articles that contradict that, you either dismiss or ignore them. So this can involve actively seeking out people who hold only the same viewpoints as you, having like a lack of thought diversity, ignoring people's counter arguments, dismissing counter arguments in intellectually dishonest ways, and so on and so forth. Most people want to feel right more than they actually want to be right. It's an ego thing. And unfortunately, that can set you up for sometimes not seeing reality for what it truly is, which bites you in the ass later on. Then there's anchoring bias, which is relying too heavily on the first piece of information that you heard. And this really hinges on something called the primacy effect, which is when we tend to prioritize the first thing that we heard over information that we heard later on. So for example, if your friend Daniela told you her side of a falling out with your mutual friend John, by the time John tells you his side of the story, you might be unconvinced because you heard it from Daniela first. Or let's say that you read an article that they found signs of life on planet Xorbitron, let's say it's called. So when scientists come out and say, actually that was a piece of fake news, you resist this new piece of information because you're already emotionally invested. You don't want to be wrong about there being life on planet Xorbitron. Then we have the availability heuristic, which says that we assess the likelihood of something happening based on how readily available examples come to mind. For example, we might assume that plane crashes happen often because there's been a lot of plane crash coverage in the media recently. Or a doctor might minimize the risks of a procedure that are well documented in the research simply because he's never seen it happen. Up next, we have the representativeness heuristic, which is comparing someone to a mental prototype that you have in your head. A classic example of this is assuming when you walk into a hospital room that the woman is the nurse and the man is the doctor. The doctor prototype is not one that you typically associate with being female, and the nurse prototype is not one that you typically associate with being male. Then there's the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is how people who tend to know very little about a topic actually overestimate how much they know about it, whereas people who learn more about a certain topic tend to be more humble about what they know. This is the classic Einstein quote that I love so much. The more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. This is why, for example, when people say, do your own research about getting their children vaccinated, it's like, my dude, do you think that you could do better research than someone who trained in this for decades, who has a higher degree of scientific literacy than you? Do you think it's possible that doing your own research might mean missing certain things that someone who comes from a scientific background would be better equipped to interpret? There is also the negativity bias, which is focusing more on negative information than on positive information. Remember the discounting the positives cognitive distortion that I mentioned earlier? This one is kind of similar to that. In the past, focusing on negativity, like what could go wrong, what's wrong about the environment, helped us survive. But now that we're not typically in imminent danger at all times, What helps us survive is actually focusing on the positive, things like joy, gratitude, love, connection. That was basically my aim with A Season of Life, the journaling workbook I created. That's all about boosting positive, pleasant emotions rather than focusing so much on the negative stuff in life. But then there's also optimism bias, which is believing that you're less at risk of experiencing negative events than other people. For example, people who smoke don't usually believe they're going to be the ones to get negative health outcomes because of it. Same with people with eating disorders, for instance, don't tend to assume they're going to be the ones that experience very negative health outcomes because of it. Actually, an example of optimism bias that was being really strongly circulated around the internet a few years was something called lucky girl syndrome, which is where you convince yourself that everything just works out fine for you. And I do think that kind of helps with your mindset. I do think that can be a healthy approach in that it makes you happier, maybe makes you more likely to fulfill that prophecy, but it's not very tethered to reality in that it doesn't allow you to truly see reality for what it is. So in that sense, could put you at a little bit of vulnerability. Then there's also hindsight bias, which is believing in hindsight that you knew it all along. So people often say, I always had a bad feeling about him. And it's like, girl, no, you didn't, because you were praising him to everyone. Now, sometimes it's true. We're very perceptive creatures. And when we look back, it's like, I knew it. But a lot of the times we tend to rewrite history to paint ourselves as some sort of fortune tellers in situations where there wasn't actually any evidence that we foresaw what was going to happen. Self-serving bias is attributing success to internal factors and failures to external factors. So for example, I got fired because my boss doesn't know what he's doing. Or I got promoted because I'm the best employee here. Well, which one is it? You can't have it both ways. This is another one of those meant to preserve ego or self-esteem. We'd rather feel good about ourselves than acknowledge the truth, which is that there are both internal and external factors at play in any outcome. Then there's the bandwagon effect, which is adopting whatever beliefs or behaviors the people around you want to do. So for example, you might sign a petition just because everyone else in your class is doing it, despite the fact that you don't actually believe in what you're signing for. This is why bots are so effective, because we tend to just want to adhere to the group. We evolved this way to be very tribalistic because belonging to a group helped us survive. And so if we weren't going along with what the group wanted, then we were putting ourselves at risk, putting our lives at risk. So that's what bots depend on. That you'll see, everyone's saying to buy this book, Kundalini Awakening. So therefore, let me buy this book, Kundalini Awakening, and oh God, here's a Trojan horse in my computer now. And the bandwagon effect also can lead to echo chambers and mob mentality. Then there's also the framing effect, which is letting our decisions be guided by how positively or negatively information is presented to us. For example, if someone says to you, 90% of participants in this study saw improvement, you might think, wow, that's a really good treatment. I should look into getting it. But if they instead say to you, 10% of participants in the study saw no improvement, you might think, so there's a 1 in 10 chance that this won't work for me. I don't know if I want to pursue it then. Be careful when people are communicating information to you. Is there an angle in how they're trying to come across? Are they trying to emphasize a particularly positive or negative angle? Is there a different way that they could say what they're saying? And if you were to hear it that way instead, would it change your decision? Then there is the sunk cost fallacy, which is continuing down a path that isn't working for you because you've already invested in that path. For example, let's say that you hate the career that you've chosen, but you don't want to quit because you've already invested time, money, and effort into it. And you have no reason to believe it's ever going to get better for you, but you convince yourself it's better to keep being unhappy forever than to just cut your losses now, without realizing that if you don't cut your losses now, your losses are going to be even worse later on. And it's the same with unhappy relationships, for instance. People would rather keep investing in something that's clearly not working, which results in further losses down the line. Then there is also illusory correlation, which is assuming there's a correlation between two variables where there is none. For example, let's say you've had negative interactions with every single Austrian person you've ever met. And let's say you've met 3 Austrian people in your life, so that's a sample size of 3. So you assume there's a correlation between rudeness and being Austrian. Or sometimes you might assume that the side effects of a medication are super common just because you happen to experience them. This isn't even about seeing causality where there is none. This is about seeing a correlation where there is none. And lastly, there is the fundamental attribution error, which is where we ascribe different explanations for what caused a positive outcome versus a negative outcome for ourselves and for other people. When something positive happens to us, we tend to assume it's because of something related to our personal character. When something positive happens to someone else, we tend to assume it's because of situational factors. When something negative happens to us, we tend to assume it's because of situational factors like, oh yeah, I was late for work, but that's only because I was stuck behind the garbage truck. But when something negative happens for other people, we tend to assume it's because of, again, personal character. That person is late because they're always late to work. They're not hardworking. You see, we have double standards for ourselves versus other people. And we do this to keep a positive view of ourselves, but a negative view of the world, which helps self-esteem and survival. Whereas a more accurate worldview would be there are both internal and external factors at play in both positive and negative situations for both myself and for others. And a healthier worldview is giving people the benefit of the doubt when things go wrong and not immediately character assassinating them. Now, again, this is not a fully comprehensive list of cognitive biases either, but just to give you an idea of some of the main ones that we talk about in psychological research. I am super curious if you recognize any of these in yourself and other people, and I highly recommend, if you want to not fall into these mental traps over the course of the next few weeks, keep a log of every time you notice yourself falling into a certain distortion or bias. Because if we don't keep up with identifying these, we fall back into old patterns. We get complacent and we become easy to manipulate. Simply knowing about these things, research indicates, is not enough to not fall into these traps. We have to actually put in the work continuously to stop ourselves from seeing things in a flawed way. Hope this was helpful, and let me know what you thought. I'll see you soon.